Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share with you some different inking techniques for card making. I did this rose card or a couple rose cards a few weeks ago, and while I was doing the background for that, I also did these other ink backgrounds. So I have some watercolor paper here, and I like to spray on both sides of the watercolor paper before I put it down on my surface. It kind of suctions it into place, and it makes the watercolor paper warp a little bit less because it's got moisture on both sides. I'm using some Distress reinkers, and for the first piece here, I'm just doing random squiggles all over the paper in some beautiful bright colors. While this ink is going to dry, because of the moisture, it's going to continue to flow and blend with each other. I added a little bit extra moisture before it dried. For the second one here, I'm doing the same thing. I misted both sides of my watercolor paper, but when I put the ink down, I'm going to do kind of stripes, kind of like a rainbow stripe. It's going to create a little bit of a different look. Neither one is right or wrong. It's personal preference. I just wanted to see how they would look at the end with the different techniques that I was going to do. So once again, same as the first one, I'm putting the inks down. I like to use Distress ink for this because it has a lot of pigment in it, and you can get some really, really bright colors with it. But if you add more water to it, you can lighten up those colors considerably. So you have a little bit of control over the colors that you're going to get. You can make them bright or keep them bright. You could make them a lot more pastel, a lot more diluted. Once again, I'm spraying with water before I let it sit and dry. Now keep in mind, because I misted both sides of this watercolor paper, it does take a little bit longer to dry because it's got moisture on the bottom of the paper as well, so it's not drying from both sides. But what I like to do is once those inks have set and a lot of the puddles have dried, I will pick them up and put them on some paper towel just to dry some of the excess moisture and speed up that drying time. Now that my pieces have dried, I'm using this beautiful embossing folder from Spellbinders. This is my first time in a long time getting some new embossing folders from Spellbinders, and I really liked this Circle Illusion one. It's got a really unique and interesting look to it. I missed the cardstock on both sides, not enough to rehydrate the ink that's in there, but just enough to soften those paper fibers to put them through my embossing machine. Now, because I haven't used Spellbinders 3D embossing folders before this, it took a little bit to figure out the stacking on my Big Shot machine. In the end, I took a few pieces of Neenah index stock and folded them in half just to get the right stacking for my machine. I'm just going to keep those with those Spellbinders embossing folders to use every time I use those folders. Now I took one of the pieces of cardstock and I embossed it so that the raised part would be, or one part would be raised, and then I did the other one the opposite way so it'd be depressed. So I have one where I've got a raised image and one where I've got a kind of depressed or letterpressed image. I did this so that I could do two different techniques for the card backgrounds, as well as I thought it just would create a more interesting look to the cards. Because I misted those pieces of cardstock before putting them through the embossing folders, I'm going to set them aside to dry before we work on the next step. So the next step here, once our cardstock is dried, is I'm taking these pieces, I'm matching them back up with the pattern of my embossing folder, and I'm taping them in place. These two pieces I am going to cut down anyways to create the fronts of my cards, so I don't need what I'm going to do to go all the way to the edges of the cardstock, but I do want to make sure that those pieces stay in place. If by chance I need to do it a couple times, I don't want to risk smearing any ink or having to place it or replace it in the right spot. So by taping it down, I can ensure that it's not going to move. And if I need to re-ink my embossing folder, because that's what I'm going to do, I know that that paper is exactly where it needs to be and it's going to stay there. For the first one, I'm using this black Archival ink and I'm just rubbing it all over my embossing folder. And I did find that if I tapped it on the embossing folder, I got a better coverage of my ink. My pad is nice and juicy. I have it freshly re-inked, so I wanted to make sure that I was going to get good coverage with that embossing folder over there. I've closed it, put it through my machine again, and that pressure is going to transfer that ink only to the parts of that embossing folder that it inked. So the parts that are raised when I'm embossing or depressed in that folder on that particular side are not going to get inked. There was a couple areas where the ink was a little bit lighter, so I decided to do it a second time just to make sure that I've got some nice solid inking there. Once I have it done and I like how it looks, I can remove that paper from my embossing folder and completely clean my embossing folder. Now I used Archival Ink here, so you need to use Archival Ink Remover or a permanent ink remover. The one that I actually have on hand is Ultra Clean, which works really, really well for permanent inks. But you do want to make sure to remove all of that ink before you go and put your embossing folder away. The ink does come off the folder really, really easily. I used some paper towel for this. You could also use a soft cloth. And then once I had all of the ink off of there, rather than trying to get that ink remover out of each and every crevice, what I ended up doing was folding a piece of paper towel in half and then just running it through my embossing folder again, just to make sure everything was removed and it was dry and clean for the next use. For the second card, what I'm doing is using a Hero Arts white pad. Now there's two different ways to do this. I have both the Hero Arts die pad as well as the pigment pad. For the die pad, because it's nice and firm, you can just rub it right over the paper. If you happen to have the pigment pad, because the pigment pad is more spongy, I would use a brayer and just run it over your paper with a brayer. The look is fairly similar between the two. I think the pigment pad gives a little bit more opacity to it, but it's fairly close. But I wouldn't use the pigment pad and rub it over, just because it's so spongy, you chance getting some of that ink in those debossed areas. Once again, make sure to clean off your brayer and clean off your tools before putting them all away. And then I use an embossing tool to completely dry that pigment ink before I move on. So there are my two backgrounds before we go and start creating cards. I am going to take them and I'm going to cut them down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches to put onto my 4¼ by 5½ inch card bases. And then I like to put an acrylic block on there just to hold it down. I do this especially for embossed backgrounds because there's so much texture in it. It's nice to have something that can hold it down and keep your hands free for working on other things. For the second one here, because the little teardrop shapes are what is debossed in it, I made sure that there was glue behind that for getting it nice and stuck to my card base. While those pieces are drying, I took out my glimmer machine and I'm going to foil some sentiments onto some hammer mill cardstock to use on the front of my cards. Now, when I'm doing foiled sentiments, I like to do both the positive and the negative. These particular ones have matching dies to them, so I'll end up with more sentiments than I really need for this card, but I just have a container. I put all the excess in so that I have ones that I can quickly grab if I need to grab a quick sentiment. I heated my glimmer machine up. When the platform said ready, I put the plates on there and then set the timer. Once that was off, I put it through my Big Shot machine. You do need the heat as well as the pressure for foiling these sentiments. Once I pulled that foil off of those plates and that cardstock, I took my Pink Fresh solid hot foil plate, put it through the machine with my excess foil, and now I'm foiling those in the Big Shot machine. Once those are completely done, I'm going to take the dies and I'm going to cut them out. With the solid pieces here, there's a little bit of clear backing that you do need to make sure to cut off. If you don't cut it off ahead of time, it does come off typically when you do your die cutting. Make sure to be really, really careful when you're placing your dies down, and I like to tape them in place so that they don't move. I also make sure not to put that tape on top of the foil because the pressure of it going through the machine, it does change the foil. When you take the tape off, it removes some of it. I wanted to continue the circle theme from the background, so I've got some circles here that I'm cutting. I'm just doing one of them on camera, the other ones I will do off camera and stack them and glue them in place. Just a nice centered image to put these floral pieces that I'm using around. I took a lot of floral die cuts and have them ready to go. This is another beautiful Spellbinders die. It'll be listed down below as well as all the other supplies I'm using and the ink colors. I think it's called Be Bold Blooms, but I'm second guessing myself. I wanted to have some color on these flowers, but I didn't want them to be completely solid with colored cardstock. So what I did was cut them all out of white hammermill cardstock, and then I took some detailed blending brushes and I added a little bit of color to the center. Typically where it would have been a shadow or whatnot, I added some color. I wanted to still have the white of the cardstock, but I also wanted to pull in some of the colors from the background. But I thought if all of these flowers were solid colors, it would just be a little bit too bright and kind of compete a bit more with the background. And I thought this was a little bit of a different way to do some flowers. I hadn't done it this way before. I haven't seen it done this way before as far as I remember. So I just thought it was a different way to do them, and I wanted to see what it would look like with these backgrounds. So I took them all, I figured out how many I would need of each of the flowers, and then I just assembled them all at once. I'm just showing you one of each of the flowers, and I am using each of the background colors that I used. This time I'm using them in ink pad form so that I have a little bit more control with that blending brush. If I were to use it with the re-inker for this, it would be too liquid and I would get too much on my die cut and I wouldn't have as much control. So using the ink pad, I can control how much color goes on there. And the nice thing about the ink pad is I could even take a scrap piece of paper and remove some of the excess ink if I wanted it even lighter than it's showing up. I'm assembling all of my die cuts so they're ready to go for my card making. I like to assemble all this stuff ahead of time. It does take a little bit of time while you're assembling it, but when it gets to time to the card making part, it makes that part of it really, really quick and easy because everything is done. We don't need to stop to assemble anything. Everything's ready to go and we can just put it all together. Once they're all assembled, I do let them sit and dry so they're good and dry before moving on to the next step. But I really like how these flowers turned out. They turned out really, really pretty and are a little bit different and unique. So off camera, I took one of the cards and I kind of placed the flowers how I was wanting them to be placed, just so that I had an idea of how I wanted the arrangement to look on my card. It's always easier to do this and not glue things down until you know exactly where you want everything to go. If you start gluing things down before you really know, then you might change your mind. Although when you use liquid glue like I'm using here, it makes it a little bit easier if you change your mind. It's always nicer though to place things once rather than moving them around. So I am using my Distress Collage medium to glue things in place. Once again, this way, if I do decide to change something or just move something a little bit out of the way, I can do that. I have a few minutes to do that. The other thing about the Distress Collage medium, it dries completely clear and it dries matte. So if any of that glue seeps out from beneath my die cuts, you won't see that it was there. I do tend to put my glue towards the center so that it's covered by the flower, so you shouldn't see it even if some of it did seep out. But I do like knowing that because it dries clear and matte, it's not going to be visible. For my flower petals, I do take my fingers and I curve the petals a little bit just to give them a little bit more of a natural shape to them. To me, it just is a little bit more dimensional. It's a little bit more interesting. And it's something I tend to do with my flower die cuts all the time anyway. So I like them better when they have some curve rather than are completely flat. I put the smaller flowers on first, and then I take my bigger flower and put it in the center. And for those flowers, because there's dimension to them, I only put the glue in the center of the flower. The next thing I'm doing is taking my sentiment and I'm gluing that in place. I always do that last so that I don't happen to have it in the way of any of my flowers. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing for the second card. I'm using the exact same flowers and I'm making the arrangement exactly the same. I typically like to do cards and I'll tweak the technique a little bit, but I'll do a couple of designs the exact same way because it takes not much more time to do 2 or 3 cards with the same design than it does to do one. So why not, rather than design one card and only make one of them, why not do a couple with a little bit of different variation? It just shows you how a few different tweaks for instance, for the black card, I'm using black archival ink on the background. For the white card, I've got that white pigment ink on the background. And you see how the cards are very, very similar, but they also look a little bit different. For the black one, I also included a black circle in the center just because having just the white one, it was a little bit too stark. But I do have one white circle between the purple and the black just to tie in the white that's there. I didn't want to be doing black die cuts with the florals because it doesn't really make any sense. And I thought it would end up being a little bit too dark. So that white brightens it up a little bit. But I did put that black circle in the center there just to kind of tie in with the background a little bit. I'll do something a little bit later to that card to also tie that black in. So there we've got all of our die cuts on the floral die cuts for the white card there. One of those flowers didn't have a center. I'm not even sure if you even noticed it or not. I just tucked it under a petal so you wouldn't even notice rather than take my machine out and cut another center. I could have done it, but I knew that it wasn't going to be visible anyways. I did put my acrylic blocks over that sentiment just to make sure that it was held down while those things were drying. I don't do it over the flowers because of the dimension. It would kind of shimmy and move things. I also took some stickles just to put in the center of that big pink flower just to add a little bit of sparkle. Once that's dry, I took a black Posca marker and I added some black dots to my flower petals just towards the center, basically where I have it inked with the pink. I'm doing it to a few of the different flowers just to tie that black in a little bit and make it a little bit different than my completely white card. I just thought it kind of unified the whole thing, and it's a simple thing to do. Posca markers are acrylic markers and you can get them with very many different tips to them. This particular one is a fairly fine tipped one. If I wanted bigger circles with it, I could use the same one and just draw circles. But for these flowers, just dots is enough just to tie everything in. So here we have two different cards, very similar, but also a little bit different. What's your favorite, the white or the black? I'm just curious. Put it in the comments down below. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a fantastic day.